morning. My name is Jerome Hsiang, and I'm the chairman of the Young Professionals Program of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you very much for joining us today for this event on the prospects and dangers of the US and China economically decoupling. Our speaker today is Professor Clay Dube, director of the US-China Institute at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. Clay has headed the institute since its inception in 2006. He has also produced documentary films on China, directs numerous publications, and currently focuses on the promise and limits of US-China cooperation. In other words, I can't really think of a better person to talk about the topic we have today. So Clay, why don't we start by you setting the stage a little bit and explain what exactly do we mean when we say decoupling? This is kind of a weird word.
Now, this is an unfortunate addition to our current vocabulary. It speaks to separating the many connections that bind the United States and China, particularly in the economic realm and in the realm of science, engineering, technological cooperation. And so it is something that some people have advocated for quite some time. They think that America is made vulnerable by its dependence on China for many imported products, by its increasing connections in terms of scientific research, medical developments, these kinds of things. So the decoupling is something that is advocated by some who believe, first of all, that it's important for America's economic security as well as its general security, and some who believe too that it's a way of putting pressure on China's government to initiate the sort of political reforms that some in the United States advocate.
So you mentioned that there are sort of different factions within the United States about obviously more than two lines of thought, but there appears to be two main camps on this. One of the things that I find fascinating is the push and pull between these two groups. Could you sort of go over what these two camps basically believe in terms of how the US should engage China in the 21st century?
There's one camp that tends to see engagement or connection, linkage with China in zero-sum terms, that it disproportionately benefits China, and that benefit comes at a cost to the United States. So that's one line of thinking. And so those people believe that by cutting these ties, by changing our economic supply chains and things like that, that we will reduce the risk to the United States and simultaneously put pressure on China for fundamental change. Others believe, and I'm in this camp, that first of all, that's completely unrealistic in today's world. And secondly, that it is through connections that you can begin to engineer fundamental change from the ground up. And no one is so naive to believe that by doing business deals, by perhaps sharing a conference, by collaborating in a scientific lab, that brings about some dramatic and immediate change. No one is that naive, but it is through gradual action that you build a comfortable working relationship, you increase trust, and that over time, this can help us to smooth out problems in the relationship.
So would you say that this process of smoothing out the problems in the relationship, of course, of which there are many, considering the different strategic and economic interests, even cultural interests of each country, do you think that over the last 30 or so years in which the United States has engaged China on various levels, has it been a success? Do we, I mean, obviously it's probably too early to tell, but can we say right now that we've come to a point where we do have to reevaluate whether the approach is working?
I think, first of all, reevaluation has to be constant. At each step, at each moment, we need to look and see, where are we now? Are we moving in the direction we want to be? And that's a natural thing for individuals, for organizations, for companies, and for states. And so evaluation should be constant, and we should ask hard questions. Are we getting what we need? Are we getting what we want from this relationship? Or are we confused about both what we need and what we want? Are we realistic? If we are realistic and we're not getting what we need and what we want, then clearly we have to change our approach. We have to make adjustments to convey to the other side, this isn't working for us. At the same time, again, I emphasized being realistic in what we think we can accomplish at any one time. And we have to be prepared to play a long game. If you're expecting things to change on a dime, to make immediate change, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to be disappointed if that's just a personal New Year's resolution, and you're going to be disappointed if you're a country working with another giant country. And so I would emphasize being realistic at each step. Don't oversell what you think can be accomplished, and don't, at the same time, abandon ship when progress is being made. You may have to adjust course, you may have to change tactics, you may have to go back a step to make it clear that this matters. But don't just say, we're walking away. We haven't gotten what we want. We have to be realistic, both in terms of the scale of change, what we get from the relationship, and the pace of change.
So one of the things that, being realistic to me, anyways, it seems, is that it's going to be an extraordinarily messy process. Whether or not we actually decouple from China, or we sort of pursue an engagement, an on-again, off-again engagement of strategy, it's going to be very messy.
I think, first of all, you're right that all of this is a little bit more difficult than we might model. But what is absolutely in evidence is I'm sorry, Jerome, you froze on me for a moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat just what the last thing you said?
Sure. You had suggested that this was going to be a messy process, and I absolutely concur. I think that's an apt description. There are going to be difficulties in the relationship, and there are going to be tensions at various times. But at the same token, even though we may decouple in certain sectors that are considered too sensitive to put at risk, and in fact, I think that kind of decoupling is going on and makes sense, but you're not going to have some wide policy across different areas of engagement, economic, scientific, political, humanitarian work. You're not going to completely disengage. You're not going to completely decouple. And so I think we have to be strategic and decouple in those areas which are important for American security or important for the security of our friends and allies. Decouple there, but don't decouple in other areas where it's of benefit to the people of the United States, to the people of China, to the globe.
So I think one of the fears that a lot of people have, especially people who do either work with China or Taiwan, is that there won't just be a decoupling in the economic realm or even the security realm, but the decoupling.
Sorry, Jerome, I think your Wi-Fi might have frozen for a second. Clay, were you able to get that question?
Well, no, I didn't hear the end of it. I heard something about economic decoupling, but perhaps other kinds of decoupling would come about. Could you repeat the question or summarize it?
I think that was essentially what he was getting to, is perhaps what is the, we're looking at the trade and military decoupling. What about the sentiment on the ground? How are people, both citizens in China and in the US, responding to this now?
Well, two quick points. First of all, I don't see an economic decoupling. If you're talking about certain sectors, things like that, definitely decoupling is happening. But if you are talking about the wide areas where the two countries and people in the two countries collaborate, that will just not happen. We are too intertwined. The Chinese market is too important for many American companies, and it's obviously working in terms of providing inexpensive goods. Now, at the same time, companies are going to seek to make their supply chains more resilient by not putting all their eggs, so to speak, in a single basket in China. We saw what happens when Chinese manufacturing shuts down. Suddenly, all sorts of goods are no longer available. And so some of this was happening anyway because of increased labor costs in China, but I think that we should expect that more of it will happen, less because of the labor costs, but rather the need to have another supplier in another location. And that location might be nearby in Asia, it might be in Latin America, in some cases it might even be back in the United States. But I don't think there's going to be a widespread relocation. Most of the companies that produce in China do so because they want to sell in China. It's not strictly for export capabilities, although that's obviously very much in evidence. So I don't think you're going to have a wholesale dislocation. So that's the first part of the answer to Jerome's question. I don't think economic decoupling is ever going to be as complete as some people would like. Some people would like it to be absolute. Don't do business with China. That's not going to happen, and that's not in the interests of Americans and others. And so I don't see that happening. But I do worry that friction in the economic relationship and antagonism in the security relationship and rising distrust could begin to affect the other realms in which we interact, the cultural, the social, the humanitarian, these kinds of things. So I am concerned about that. If I could, for just a moment, show a slide that helps to illustrate this. This slide shows polling that was done by the Pew Research Center in China for a period of time. It hasn't been able to do this kind of research in China recently, but in the United States, looking at American attitudes towards China. And you can see a couple important trends. First of all, that Americans have been gradually trending towards more negative on China. And today, 2 out of 3 Americans have an unfavorable attitude towards China. They see China in unfavorable terms. What's a little bit striking is that now young people are in that group. And so young people, we see 43% having an unfavorable impression. Fairly unchanged for people between 30 and 49 and people over 50. So that is striking. And one of the things that surprises me is that those with a college degree are more negative towards China today than those without, right? That we see, or I'm sorry, that it's roughly the same, that 3 out of 4 people with a college degree have an unfavorable view of China. Okay, so that is pretty striking. And I suspect that that's not so much about the trade tensions and not even about the current health crisis, but rather it stems from frustration with China on human rights related issues. The situation in Xinjiang, the persecution of human rights lawyers, putting pressure on any kind of civil society action, be you for women's rights or greater accountability and transparency. I think that's what's produced this negative feeling on the part of Americans towards China, is it's very much focused on those political aspects. Trade is definitely part of it, but mainly on the political side.
So do you think that, given the way that the public opinion in the United States seem to be shifting, especially with the young people, towards a more negative view of China, is this a temporary shift, do you think, or is this actually a long-term a change, in your opinion?
Well, I think the decline, especially among young people, has been rapid. And I think that it can be tied really to coverage of human rights concerns and other sorts of things. I think for older Americans, definitely the resentment over trade, concerns about security issues, whether or not China represents a threat to its neighbors, these kinds of things, and certain concerns about intellectual property theft, espionage, that sort of thing, that all weighs in. I think that just as it has turned negative, it could begin to turn positive. But 2 things have to happen. We have to be open to seeing positive shift, but more important and completely out of American control is what happens in China. If the Chinese government begins to treat its own citizens more equitably, not engaging in detention based on who you are, but only something you may have done, things like that, that will improve American attitudes. Americans, I think, are predisposed to be positive towards the Chinese people. And it's important to understand that this is an assessment, this polling is an assessment of the big picture. This is not a judgment about Chinese people. This is a judgment about the Chinese state. Just as Chinese opinion towards Americans tends to be somewhat different from Chinese opinion towards the American government.
I think, I believe there was a film that was recently made by, I believe it's Barack Obama's production company, about a Chinese, I guess a Chinese car parts manufacturer, I think in the Midwest. And I think what that illustrates is just how interconnected the 2 countries are at this point. That's something that may not actually be appreciated, because I think a lot of times people think of just the manufacturing aspect and not everything else. So I think I just wanted to relay a story that I remember hearing yesterday that really demonstrates just how weird, how bizarre this entire situation is. Yesterday, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, had delivered a speech at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. And of course, the content of the speech was fairly expected. It was critical of the Chinese government on the coronavirus and the expulsion of journalists, American journalists from China. But at least what I found really fascinating was that he actually delivered that entire speech, which is a substantial one, in Mandarin Chinese. And he also, to me, like as more in terms of the scholarly aspect, it's amazing that he dove really deeply into the May 4th movement and the Chinese intellectual history of the early 20th century. So this seems remarkable to me because on one hand, this is an administration that seems, especially Mr. Pottinger himself, he seems to be fairly hardline against China. On the other hand, he speaks nearly perfect Chinese and went out of his way to speak literally in the same language as the Chinese intellectual elite in the government. So this strikes me as a very different tone because I feel like in the past, the US has a tendency to sort of talk to China on the level of, say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How is this a new strategy? Is this idea that we want the Chinese to be better, we want them to do better on these things, but we almost want them to do better because it makes sense to themselves?
Mm-hmm. Well, Jerome, you've just made several big points, and let me respond to each of them in turn. First, you have an appreciation for the film The American Factory, which won the won the Academy Award for Best Documentary, and I believe very much deserves it. The Obama involvement came about, as the film was finished, so it's not as though they initiated the project. It's a wonderful film available for streaming on Netflix. And what I like about it is it doesn't sugarcoat any aspect of this. You see the difficulties of working across the two cultures. You see the aims of the Chinese business that comes to Ohio and resurrects what had been a shuttered GM factory. You see their ambition, you see the mistakes they make, you also see their, how mystified they are by some American expectations. And you see on the American side, a desire to make this work. You also see some unreasonable expectations on the part of the American side. You see political machinations, all of that sort of thing. It speaks to the difficulty, the messiness, the reality of doing business across these cultures. So I heartily recommend that particular film. Now, fast forward to yesterday, to Matt Pottinger speaking on the 101st anniversary of the May 4th movement, which began in Beijing on May 4th, 1919. He was very strategic because what he talked about was the notion that liberal democracy is not Western, that in fact you have Chinese advocating for it from a very early date and talking about being open to greater array of voices, more diversity in opinion, that sort of thing. And he is calling for a return to that spirit. Now, this is a very strategic use of Chinese history. And he also makes reference to the Chinese role in creating the United Nations, the Universal Declaration, these kinds of things. And so what he's trying to say is China, by living up to the expectations of Chinese, will be a better place for Chinese. And that's what he's calling for. Now, he's pushing a pretty hard line on this, right? But he is doing it in a way that could have an impact. Now, the reality is that the vast majority of Chinese don't know who Pottinger is, didn't hear him speak quite eloquently in Chinese, and that's part of the challenge, is penetrating the propaganda state, where the Chinese government blocks a lot of forums that are used in the United States and elsewhere, and restricts that kind of contact. But it shows that, first of all, Pottinger lived and worked in China for 7 years, has outstanding Chinese, has an appreciation for Chinese culture, has an appreciation for Chinese history, and wants to what? Interact with people where they are. And that's a good step in and of itself. Now, he's not the first American official who can speak Chinese well, but he's the first to give a speech from inside the White House, aiming at a Chinese-speaking audience.
Right, great. So I think we are going to open it up for questions from the audience now, and Jessica is going to join us to read some of those questions. If you have any questions for Clay, please go ahead and click on the question section in your control panel and send them, and we'll try to get to as many as you can. Okay, Jessica, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. This one is from Ira Kassoff. He says, thanks, Clay. Do you know who in the administration favors decoupling and who opposes? And how strong is each group?
First of all, hi, Ira. It's great that you're a part of this discussion. I think, first of all, I'm not an insider, so I couldn't map this out very clearly, but it's obvious that Peter Navarro is very much on the decoupling side, who wants to separate the United States economically from China, finds that anything that helps China hurts the United States. So he would be that one particular faction. Others are less committed to it. We know, for example, that Michael Pillsbury is supportive of some decoupling, but also appreciates the multi-threaded nature of the relationship. You have, of course, economic advisor Kudlow, who is probably more on the we need to find a way to work together side of things, but it's hardly clear. Trump himself is clearly not in one camp or the other. He may find it politically expedient, though, to really put all of his chips on the everything that's wrong with America right now is tied to China line. That seems to resonate with his base, and he may play that out. But over the past several years, he has constantly acknowledged that American business benefits from engagement, and the broad American public benefits from that economic relationship. So I think that President Trump himself is not on one side or the other, although his rhetoric would suggest that he's firmly in the decoupling camp.
Thank you. Can you summarize the pros and cons of pending US trade deals / negotiations with China?
Well, first of all, I don't think anything's pending. I think all of that is dead in the water, and there won't be any trade negotiations until either this administration is returned to office or there's a new administration. The deal that was completed in January did call for China to make a lot of purchases that, given current economic circumstances in China, seem unrealistic to think that that's going to happen necessarily at that scale in the short term. At the same time, we have President Trump saying, if China doesn't step up, if China doesn't meet those expectations, he's going to cut off access to the American market. He's going to pick up the tariff sledge again and bash China. So number one, there are no pending negotiations. Number two, even sticking to the terms of the just agreed to deal is going to be tricky.
Thank you. Can you talk about the response of China's neighbors like Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines? What has been their response to China in this, and will this increase tensions or cooperation for them?
When we say this, are we talking about COVID-19 or the tensions between the United States and China?
I think they're referring to the pandemic.
Now, both Japan and South Korea, are very close and completely intertwined with China. Something like a third of Japan's tourist industry is tied to visitors from China. In the case of Korea, a lot of exports, all kinds of interplay there. And so they were paying very close attention to the threat posed by COVID-19. Now, South Korea is a much smaller country than China or Japan or the United States, and brought a lot of energy to bear and seems to have managed the crisis pretty well. Japan Japan's approach has been a little bit more haphazard, and because of the risk, of course, the Olympics have been canceled and these kinds of things. But what they have observed is that there's no useful reason to cut themselves off from China, to engage in heavy finger pointing and things like that. What happened when the outbreak began in China is that Japan engaged in donation diplomacy, and they donated things and made a lot of a splash about it. And in fact, the Chinese press celebrated it. Opinions of Japan improved in China. At the same time, the United States business community also mobilized, donated tens of millions of dollars of equipment and financial resources to try to help China in this particular moment. Less attention was paid to that. And so at that moment, Japan actually rose in the opinion of many Chinese, especially younger Chinese.
Thank you. The Communist Party has persecuted human rights lawyers, Tibetan Buddhists, and Uyghurs. So doesn't the growing negative view of China really need to be recast as growing negative views towards the communist dictatorship and not xenophobia?
I think, yeah, there are some people in both countries who, have very negative opinions about the other people. But the vast majority of people understand that the actions of a particular government are the actions of a government and not necessarily the actions of an entire people. And that's why I think the vast majority of Americans, although they have an unfavorable impression of China, the country, they don't have an unfavorable impression of the Chinese people. And they, in fact, are supportive of the various groups that you just highlighted, the human rights lawyers, the women's groups, other activists, the ethnic minorities that have been persecuted. There's sympathy towards those people, and there's sympathy towards the vast majority of Chinese people, who most Americans recognize are very much like ourselves. They have hopes and ambitions, and they have fears. And so what is important here is to separate it out. And I think that the question seems to be pointing at, it's really important for America's political leaders, if they want to mobilize to oppose various Chinese government actions, to make it clear that it's the government, it's the party state that is being criticized, that is being opposed, not the Chinese people, and certainly not the continued expansion of the Chinese economy, the rise in living standards, and the good health of the Chinese people.
Thank you. Where do the tariffs that China pays go, and how has that affected prices of goods in the United States?
Well, it depends on the particular product at the particular moment, that sort of thing. But in general, of course, the tariffs are worked into the cost that consumers pay. It may not happen immediately. Some companies may choose to take smaller profits so that they can continue to hold market share, hoping that the trade war would pass, that sort of thing. But in general, tariffs get passed on to the consumer. And so these are a tax on the consumption of those products. Now, the idea is, of course, that by raising these products, you would encourage companies in the United States to either find suppliers outside of China or to produce those goods inside the United States. And some of that has happened, but for the most part, it just means consumers get to pay more.
Thank you. This one says, thank you, Clay and Jerome. Asian racism has been extended through the Trump administration via the POTUS rhetoric in the US and globally via COVID-19 being a Chinese virus. Is there any foresight of these anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiments continuing to ruminate for the foreseeable future in the US and globally, possibly ruining foreign relations with other nations and China?
We have seen, and it's been documented, that there have been, there's a rise in hate crimes directed towards Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, but often just more generally Asian Americans. And we see all kinds of really horrific rhetoric on the internet, suggestions that this is attributable to Chinese attitudes towards diet or hygiene, that sort of thing. And all of that, of course, is harmful. It's harmful for people of Asian ancestry in the United States, and it poisons the well. It's a propaganda win for the Chinese government, because it speaks to the idea that Americans really just don't like Chinese, that they blame Chinese, that they're opposed to it. And so it's very destructive. And it's not representative of what most Americans think and feel. And so this is why it's so important for all of us, certainly those of us who work in this realm, to condemn that racist behavior, that racist rhetoric at every turn. It's not American. It is really destructive. And so we want to oppose it at every turn. We want people of all ethnicities to feel welcome, to feel that their contributions are appreciated, and we want to encourage that. And so it's important for organizations such as this one, the World Affairs Council, but also for universities. And we have, together with others, the Asia Society and a whole host of other groups, spoken out against this kind of thing. And it's imperative that all of us do it. It's not helpful if political figures use this language and intend to inflame rather than to inform.
Thank you. Is China's political system flexible enough as China rises to become a world superpower?
Hard to know. And I know that answer is a disappointment. You'd like clearly yes, clearly no. What we have seen is that the Chinese Communist Party has proven itself remarkably flexible. We saw it at the beginning of this century when they began to welcome capitalists into the party. They wanted them to be part of the governing structure so as to co-opt them and to mobilize their talents. We've seen that kind of adjustment. Now, what is less clear is whether or not China's in a position to do things that may not be immediately beneficial to China, but that benefit the larger world. And in so doing, they will attract supporters, they will attract fans, they will attract people who will say, hey, China is providing public goods. And that is an important step. That's part of what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. The Belt and Road Initiative has economic imperatives, but it also has domestic political imperatives as well as geopolitical imperatives. They're seeking to use that to build relationships, to build a reputation. At the same time, when the United States withdraws from world leadership, it opens that space. It opens that space. We have benefited from the global system created after 1945, as has China, and we ought not simply walk away from it.
Thank you. Do you see rising nationalism in China? Is the idea that continued relations and introduction to international organizations is going to really inspire them to take on democratic values, or do they actually support the CCP? Do they want to cooperate or just dominate?
They is a very big word, and so it's hard to know exactly what they means in any particular instance. Is China seeking a larger place in the world? Absolutely. Is it ready to take on the kinds of responsibilities that the United States has taken on? No, no. It's crazy, for example, that we would be upset with the World Health Organization and want to withdraw funding from it. We have built the World Health Organization as a country. We have supported it. Now we ought to hold it to high standards and to demand accountability, transparency, but we have to be realistic in what international organizations can deliver. And we have to be realistic in, our portion of that, the role that we play in it. It's important, again, to hold these institutions to a high standard, but does China seek to dominate? China certainly wants to be the player in its neighborhood. No question about that. All sorts of evidence to support it, the military buildup, the mobilization of resources, the kinds of investments made, the pressures put, the constant harping about core interests, these kinds of things. This is all about that. Does China want to be the player in the world? There are no doubt some Chinese that harbor that kind of fantasy, but most do not. They just simply want to carve out a comfortable space for China. And they want to be dominant in their region, no question, and they want to be protect themselves against any kind of vulnerability. And so the efforts in the South China Sea, for example, are about that. They feel a profound sense of vulnerability because China's economy is tied to fossil fuels. It's a big player in renewable energy, but most of its energy has to be imported and it has to come through the South China Sea. And since the United States is the dominant player and could cut off that flow, that's a problem for them. At the same time, not all Chinese can appreciate that America is also concerned that energy be able to flow to Japan, to South Korea, to Taiwan, and as a consequence, want to keep those lanes open. There's little evidence that China actually wants to be able to cut off those folks. China benefits from its economic ties with Japan, its economic ties with Taiwan, its economic ties with South Korea. And so I don't see that as a potential threat, but China is determined to erase its perceived vulnerability to American naval power.
Thank you. Are there any specific sectors or industries that could be mostly decoupled? I'm thinking here of critical dual-use technologies, certain advanced manufacturing equipment, etc. Should we, for instance, try to onshore all components of, say, motherboards?
Well, it wouldn't make a lot of sense that every motherboard be made in the United States. Not all applications are equal. And so you certainly want to have capacity in terms of semiconductors, and you want, first of all, to secure those supply chains as well as to secure the integrity of those things. Now, all the companies that are involved in this, Intel, Qualcomm, Samsung, all of these folks worry about this a lot and put a lot of time and energy in that. Are there sectors where some sort of decoupling, first of all, it's already happening? Yes, telecommunications would be the main one. And it has to do with the question of 5G. It has to do with whether or not the software, for example, the Android operating system, these kinds of things are the same worldwide. You may have the emergence of a China telecom universe where Chinese standards come to dominate. Now, the Chinese government has sought to do that at various times in the past, but ultimately said, no, we can't do this. We want to be an international player. We want to adhere to international standards. We want to sell our goods everywhere. And to do that, you have to create and meet these international standards. But we do see narrowing. The Chinese, for example, telecommunications market, with regard to the networks itself, things like that, it's increasingly closed off to foreigners. And that seems likely to continue. At the same time, all the handsets, these kinds of things, including those made by Huawei, ZTE, Xiaomi, they rely on components and software that originates elsewhere. Let me just, if I can share a screen for just a second here. This shows why China is committed to research and development and is increasing the amount of its GDP invested in research and development, as well as why it wants to build this out. China is dependent on imports of intellectual property services. So we see this, that the European Union is a huge exporter, okay, of these things. It also imports a lot. The United States, big exporter of IP services. China, almost no IP exports, but China is dependent on importing intellectual property from abroad. And they see that as two things. One, a strategic vulnerability, because they need the United States, they need Japan, they need Germany. And two, they see it also as a missed economic opportunity. They see this as the high terrain that'll be important for companies to, for countries to be in these critical markets. And so my point there is simply, this is what China is going about doing. And it's using the size of its domestic market and privileging Chinese competitors within that, and then assuming that those companies will then be able to go abroad and, using the profits derived within China, undercut suppliers, potential suppliers from Europe, from the United States, from Japan, elsewhere. And so there is a lot at play. And this is where the United States needs to be a leader and to work with the European Union, to work with Japan, to put pressure on China to continue to open to these foreign producers, to continue to have a more fair competitive environment, not to use a protected domestic market so as to then outcompete others on the international market.
Thank you. Are protests in Hong Kong dead in the water?
Well, now everybody wears a mask. No, I would not say that they are dead in the water. What we do see, though, is that for health reasons, obviously, you can't, randomly assemble crowds on the scale that the Hong Kong protests have mobilized. People, 1 million, 2 million people gathered together. That doesn't make any sense today. But the concerns of people in Hong Kong have not gone away. And in fact, over the last several weeks, the increased discussion about imposing a new security legislation and doing these kinds of things. Other people saying that, in fact, the basic law, the provision of one country, two systems, that sort of thing, that might be dead in the water. There's a lot of tension over this. The arrests of Jimmy Lai, Martin Lee, others have woken people outside of Hong Kong and outside of China to the continuing struggle to preserve civil liberties, especially free speech, free association in Hong Kong, to maintain what the Chinese government promised when it agreed to the restoration of Chinese control over Hong Kong.
Thank you. How ugly do you expect Trump's and Biden's anti-China rhetoric to become in this election year? How will China react?
I hope for a high level, sophisticated, nuanced discussion of the importance and the nature of US-China relations. That's what I hope for. That's not necessarily what I'm expecting. We didn't get that in previous presidential campaigns, and so one would expect that this would likely continue. But we have evidence that Joe Biden is offering a more nuanced view of China, not condemning China uniformly, acknowledging the many impressive things that China has achieved, as well as the need to work with China on important issues. For President Trump, he doesn't feel any of those needs. He has not been suggesting that we need to collaborate against global warming, right? Completely, that is not a concern. He has emphasized a zero-sum attitude towards trade, thinking that every dollar made by a company based in China exporting to the United States is a dollar stolen from America, when in fact, it's the sort of thing that happens every day. People engage in exchange. I have a trade deficit with Costco, but I still shop at Costco because it meets my needs. And so, will we have a nuanced discussion? I doubt it, but that's what we need. And that's what organizations like this one can provide, can kind of sweep some of the rhetoric, the dog whistles to particular audiences, sweep that aside and focus on the realities of the relationship. Not to be naive about the relationship and not to ignore the horrible things that exist in China and in the US-China relationship. We shouldn't ignore any of these things, but we have to address this in a systematic, methodical, nuanced way. Unfortunately, political campaigns tend to be methodical, they tend to be systematic. Nuance is not something that we should expect.
Thank you. We have so many more questions, but I realize we are running out of time. So we will have to have you back at some point. Jerome, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Clay, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, yeah, there's got to be hundreds of questions about this topic. So Clay, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. The US-China relationship is definitely one of the most complicated and important of our time. And it seems to me that the stakes of this relationship couldn't be higher for both countries and, in fact, the world at large. So finally, I would like to thank our entire audience for joining us today. Please visit our website, lawac.org, to learn about our upcoming live streams, including one with the former director of the National Economic Council, Gene Sperling. We also have one with the former California Governor, Jerry Brown, coming up, and the Consul General of Israel, Hillel Newman. You can also become a member or make a tax-deductible contribution to support and sustain our mission of the Council to host discussions with leaders on national and international topics. As Clay was saying, this is the kind of forum that you want to support if you want to see this kind of nuanced detail. And if you look at the, in fact, a handout attached with all of our upcoming programs. So thank you again, Clay. Thank you again to all the audience members who are joining us. And as always, stay safe, stay informed, and see you again soon.